The overall purpose of this training module is to support educators in recognizing and building intentional and symbolic communication in the students with significant disabilities they teach. But to begin, it's important for us to have a shared understanding of the fact that everyone communicates. Individuals communicate in many different ways. The repertoire of communication skills that our students have are often impacted by the nature of their disabilities. But all of the vocalizations, body movements, gestures, grabbing our hand, pointing, all of these things are means of communication. Most of the time, when we think about supporting intentional symbolic communication for this group of children, we're thinking about aided communication, or the use of symbols and objects and other representations of speech. The range of non-symbolic communication behaviors that we observe in students include, at the most basic level, physiological responses. So a child might display frustration or sadness or happiness by an increased heart rate, or we might recognize an increase in their breathing. They might have a smile that comes across their face. All kinds of different physiological responses to the environment that we can learn to interpret and that we need to act upon if we're going to build intentional communication skills in these beginners. Many of our students are able to make vocalizations or sounds and maybe produce some words, but at this non-symbolic level, we're talking about the vocalizations that students make that aren't speech approximations, the kinds of cry that we might hear or the shriek with excitement. The sounds that we want to try to support and build upon, but are just one component of these non-symbolic communication skills that we see. We can watch students displaying feelings and emotions in more intentional ways than many of the physiological signs that we might see. So we may see students laughing when they see something funny, or smiling to get someone's attention from across the room. Students will use tactual communication by taking our hand and pushing it in the direction of something that they want. They might reach out and scrub on something to let us know that they're interested in it in some way. General body motions like rocking in response to something that they're hearing, music or rhythm. As we begin to move towards gestures, there are conventional and non-conventional gestures. Some conventional gestures might be things like a wave or a point to somewhere, and non-conventional gestures might be the kinds of signs and idiosyncratic things that we've learned to interpret for the students that we're working about. Visual communication is really when students start using the sense of sight and they start maybe looking over at something as a way that they communicate to us early interest. Not the kind of looking at a symbol that we want when we get to coordinated eye gaze, but really early something catches their attention and they use their sight to look at and then follow that thing. And that is communicating to us some level of interest. Across all of these areas, we have to think about the fact that these non-symbolic communication efforts can be non-intentional, meaning that students are communicating to us without really having an understanding of that if they do these things, we'll know what they mean. But in fact, it's these non-conventional, they're doing things that we've learned to interpret, and we add meaning or map meaning onto what they've done. These same non-symbolic communication behaviors continue over time as communicators become more and more intentional, and we start using these behaviors in order to try to communicate something intentionally to somebody else. The place where we're trying to get our students in being able to communicate in a conventional way with the world is doing some form of symbolic communication. Symbolic communication involves talking, using words. It can involve sign language, and that may be formal American Sign Language or some personalized system of hand and arm gestures. Symbols can be photographs or pictures. They could be small objects, miniature objects, or parts of objects, or they can be other kinds of symbol sets, like the kinds of board maker or symbol sticks, symbols that we often see in our classrooms. As you'll see later in a video segment by Dr. Carol Zangari, you'll see that we have many students who learn to use non-symbolic communication means in really efficient ways to communicate their intent to other people. But it isn't until we build these symbolic communication skills that we really open up communication for the students that we teach. These symbolic skills allow students to have more success communicating with a broader audience. They allow students to communicate about things that aren't in the here and now. It is one of the big distinctions between non-symbolic and symbolic communication is that most non-symbolic means require that whatever it is we're trying to communicate about is presently happening or in the immediate environment. And symbolic communication allows us to talk about things that have happened at a different time and a different place, or objects that aren't immediately present. To make sure that people are really thinking about this non-symbolic communication, I want to emphasize the fact that, in fact, as teachers, we use a lot of non-symbolic communication behaviors in our interactions with students. We might do things like snap our fingers or clap our hands in order to gain attention. We might wave. We might model a physical behavior in order to elicit it from somebody else. We might help a learner anticipate what's coming next by physically supporting them and beginning to move towards where they're going. We might use non-symbolic communication to do things like smile broadly to show our approval of what's going on. And a lot of head nodding and these sort of gestures and physical behaviors that we do all day long in order to engage and maintain the interest of the people that we're working with and try to keep this interaction going back and forth. So it's not that non-symbolic behaviors are of lesser value or lesser importance. They just tend to start developing long before most children develop any form of symbolic communication. And so we need to learn to recognize them and build on them over time. These non-symbolic communications require first that we understand and respond, that somehow we're able to interpret the purpose of this communication from the student that we're working with, and that we're not afraid to make that interpretation, that we have some accurate and appropriate understanding of why it is that this is going on, and that somehow it then has an effect, that we are willing and able to respond to it. It doesn't mean that students always get whatever they request, or that we stop doing something that is maybe not a child's favorite activity at the time, but that we're acknowledging, understanding, and responding to whatever the communication is that's going on the other end. This was just meant as an intro, a snapshot to get you thinking about all of the behaviors that we see across the day that really are communication behaviors, even if they're not intentional, even if they're not symbolic, that we need to learn to recognize, value, and build on those skills over time. Our goal isn't to make non-symbolic behaviors go away. Our goal is to make these non-symbolic communication behaviors become more intentional over time. Thank you.